I'm Terese Svoboda, and I live in New York City, but I grew up in Ogallala, Nebraska. After graduating from Ogallala High School, I went to 8 colleges. I got very good at registering, and I love libraries, actually. I went from library to library. And I ended up at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver with a BFA in studio art and creative writing. And then I went on to Columbia for an MFA. Marie Sandos, perhaps. If she didn't write perfect prose, she wrote emotionally true material. That was really important to me. Willa Cather less, except I admired her ambition. And those are the 2 Nebraska authors. Well, Weldon Keys is fascinating, and his career maybe is most like mine, as he ended up in New York and then ended up at the end in San Francisco. But he also worked in a multiple genre field. And otherwise, you know, the sky's the limits. I've been influenced by many people. Perhaps because I was educated in the 70s, minimalist prose and surrealism. I remember I did a talk on this once, and it was sex and surrealism. That was the thing, you know, from the 60s and 70s. It was the major force of writing and expressing yourself. I always said that I went into writing because at university I discovered it was the course that didn't require exams. But then I began to go through my papers for archiving them, and I discovered I had a spiral-bound notebook that I had written into at the age of 10, and it was the Golden Book of Poetry, and I had actually indexed all the poems that I'd written from the age of 7 on. They were very golden bookish, you know, rhymed and about kings and queens, so I guess I got my start early. I also wrote a family newspaper because I'm the eldest of 9. There was always some news. And I remember it was all very, it was as if it were typeset in 2 columns with pictures that I glued on in the middle. So it was very serious. So of course we have Great American Desert, which is a collection of stories that are based on the idea of water in the Midwest and the climate crisis. A number of them actually happening around Ogallala, where I grew up. All Aberration was my first book of poetry, and the cover shows a stalk of wheat wound with barbed wire and has a number of early poems. I think it was published when I was about 35, so I wasn't such a prodigy. Tin God, which is another novel about a conquistador lost in the tall grasses of Nebraska, who hears Native Americans whispering, but he can't find them. And that's alternating chapters with a couple of farm boys who throw a bag of dope into the same field 500 years later, and the 2 stories come together at the end. That was really fun to write. Bohemian Girl. Well, that's a novel about me in the 19th century, more or less. I mean, it's really a story about a little girl who's given away in a bet with a Native American, and what happens. You know, one has to attack Willa Cather if you're from Nebraska head on, I think. Trailer Girl and Other Stories was also set in a gully near where I grew up, and I imagined a wild child that was lost amidst some cattle in that gully, and there was a woman who has been let out of a mental institution who insists she sees her, and what ensues, and a number of very avant-garde short stories that go with that, one of which I think Ladette Randolph put in her collection of Nebraskan short stories. And then the last one is Black Glasses Like Clark Kent, which is a memoir about my uncle, who was an MP in post-war Japan, whose captain brought all the MPs together in this stockade that contained all American criminals in the army at the end of World War II. And he said, we're going to have to start executing them because there wasn't room in the stockade. And so it's a complicated memoir about race, the military, and what an 18-year-old boy in that situation, what kind of trouble he could get into. Because I began as a poet, I consider each word, and I'm also a minimalist. I like to put emphasis on all of the muscle that verbs in particular can lend to a sentence. The Gordon Lish, the Captain Fiction from the 90s, was one of my teachers, and he believed that the sentence was the most important thing and not character and plot. So, and the so-called transparent writing that is supposed to surround character and plot, that you could make people turn the page if the sentence is interesting enough, if it's something that you've never seen before, or if it withholds information that you really want to see given. And the longer you withhold the information, the longer the reader will read. So with that in mind, it gives, well, his belief was always we were running toward the 21st century, and we needed something other than the 19th century form of prose to show that we had evolved. And what it produced in me was an emphasis on what I could steal from those very clever poets who were always on the avant-garde, looking for ways to refresh the language, and to pull that information or those techniques into prose writing. Well, the stories in Great American Desert were written over a period of about 25 years. The last story I wrote was Major Long Talks to His Horse, which was just a couple of years ago, right before I had to turn the manuscript in. And it was to explain what the Great American Desert was and where it came from. But otherwise, the stories came from about 200 short stories I've had published, and I would take them and arrange them not at first chronologically as written sometimes, and sometimes by theme or by alphabetically, all kinds of ways, and nothing seemed to be reasonable until I did once arrange them all about the prairie chronologically. And then I could see that water trickled through all of them, more or less, from the tears in one story to actual underground aquifer water. That came out of a lot of research with the NDEQ of Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of of Environmental Quality. Some sources that I have in South Dakota. There was a woman, Susan Henderson, who had a ranch next to the Black Hills Army Depot. She was very helpful. There was a considerable lot of information there because I had always wanted to turn it into a nonfiction piece, but at the time, the literary world was flooded with disaster stories. Aaron Brockovich was just a couple of years earlier, and the fact that they had seen pools of chromium crystals around in the Black Hills, which were like 100 times worse than what she had seen, didn't seem to be of interest anymore to the public. You have to, the moment the material is presented is very important, and sometimes maybe fictionally you can reach more people rather than a hard-hitting piece, particularly about the climate at this point. Everyone is disinterested in those terrifying facts. And Great American Desert begins in the prehistoric era and ends in the science fiction realm. And the concept is really that a man's short lifespan it's very difficult to comprehend the kinds of changes that we have wrought. And so I lay it out in the long run. I was watching Ted Kooser on this series, and Ted is very intelligent about that question. He writes for an actual audience, and it's very smart. I don't. I write to amuse myself, and and I don't have an audience. I have people who read my work as it is progressing, and they can tell me whether or not I'm being coherent, and you know, if you left the car here and it's not in the next scene, what happened? And that's part of the reason why it's usually difficult for me to get rid of my manuscripts, is because I don't think about that eager reader. But the eager reader is very hard to please in the back of one's mind, and so I find that it's better to ignore the audience and bring them to me rather than me to them. Since I live in New York, you probably assume that I'm completely cut off from everything that goes on here, so I wanted to make a point of that. I've done keynotes for the Cather International Seminar, for the Nebraska Book Festival, for Bellevue, for, well, I lectured on Cather at the Cosmopolitan Club in New York City, spreading the word. I co-produced a TV program called The Quilted Conscience, which was about Sudanese refugees in in Grand Island, working with Grand Island women to make quilts, which the concept has been duplicated across the country, and the video is played on PBS everywhere. And that was derived from my second book, which was Clean the Crocodile's Teeth, New Air Songs, when I traveled to the Sudan as part of a National Geographic and Smithsonian project to make a film about some people in the South Sudan called the New Air, which changed my life utterly. But that brings me to my next contribution, is that a number of years ago I teamed up with some South Sudanese here in Lincoln to put on a project with UNL, pointing out the similarities between New Air land and Nebraska, because there's such so many refugees here, in fact more than anywhere else in the world outside of where they are supposed to be living in the South Sudan, that attendance was high and everyone was very enthusiastic. I got a few people to sing New Air songs, and I had a whole slideshow as to how there were parallels, and there are. You know, they're cattle people, and they live next to a big lazy river, and well, anyway, that was a wonderful experience. I have only one piece of advice, which is told to me by the famous short story writer Grace Paley. She said, low rent. That's it for a writer. Talent is not really required. Perseverance is obvious, but low rent is the only thing that really gets it done. It's not really an occupation, it's more an obsession. And the more you do it, the scientists have discovered, the more you're able to do it. So that gets rid of a lot of people who think that writing is just sitting at the typewriter and typing their stories, because the complexity of putting forth poetry or a finished piece of prose is such that you really have to return to it over and over again. So that you have to enjoy the moment of process when you're recasting the story, or when you're moving 10 words somewhere else to make it beautiful, and recognize that it will be a long process, and enjoy that.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors in Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Diane Wilson. I'm the curator of our collection here, and I wanted to tell you about the Heritage Room has kind of a unique status here in Lincoln City Libraries, because we're funded by an endowment that's supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and that was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. Through membership, programming, and fundraising. And LHA makes events like today's possible. And I wanted to thank the members that are present for their support. So the mission of the Heritage Room is to preserve and promote literature by and about Nebraska authors. One way that we do it is by providing the John H. Ames Reading Series as a venue for authors to share their books, and this enables our community of readers to learn about the great literary talent in our state. So today is the 221st event since our program started in 1985. This afternoon, we're pleased to host Terese Svoboda. A Guggenheim Fellow, Terese is the author of 18, now 19 books, I believe, of fiction, poetry, memoir, biography, and a book of translation. Her most recent book is a collection of short stories called Great American Desert. Among her many awards are the Bobst Prize in Fiction, the Iowa Prize for Poetry, the O. Henry Award for the short story, and a Pushcart Prize for the essay. She's appeared at the LA Book Festival, Chicago Printers Row, the Miami Book Festival, and also the Brooklyn Book Festival. Terese has taught at the College of William and Mary, San Francisco State University, Sarah Lawrence College, the New School, and many other colleges and universities. So please help me welcome Terese Svoboda.
Thank you, Diane, for inviting me, and thanks for all of you showing up, and half of the book club, apparently. So what I thought I'd do is give you a tour. And the first, I'm going to read you my best poem. Since you're all fresh, anyway. This came out of an exercise, a very complicated 20-part exercise. There's not a lot left of the exercise, but you'll see. It's called Bridge Mother. Mother burns on the other side of the bridge. Mother burns the bridge and is safe on the other side. Mother is not on the bridge when it burns. When Mother says burn, the bridge burns. We can't get to the other side. The bridge is burning. Mother is the bridge that we burn. She is how we get to the other side. We can't burn the bridge without her. Mother burns, and we burn, bridge or no bridge. She is the other side. Nothing burns the bridge, and then it burns. You don't have to clap up for everyone. I'll think, oh, that wasn't a very good one. You didn't like it that much. This is my first book of poetry, All Aberration. You see the wheat field, the stalk of wheat with its barbed wire bouquet. And at the end, here's a poem called Roundup. I'm from Ogallala. And I can hear my father's yahoo and the hooves coming closer. The herd heading for the gate, which is inexplicably open. For a long time, the horses have known about it. They whinny with their heads down. From under their hooves, the blank, slight swell of earth opens like an egg cut with a knife. And I can hear curses and the bull's body smashing into the missile as it springs into place. For a moment, all my father's UFO fantasies are vindicated, those culled from the prairie's emptiness. A thrill of pride winds up his gut, an intoxication like the Sioux who imagined they owned all they could ride through. But before it fires, a transparency comes over us all, the cow against the wedge of a daytime moon, all 4 feet lifted, the rodeo trophies in the bunkhouse showing their armatures, my father's love for a woman other than my mother, apparent in the rounding of her name in his throat hole. Then the buffalo's thunder returns just ahead of a great prairie fire that wants grass 6 feet high, what's left of the imagination. I didn't think I'd written science fiction before. This is a book called Tin God, and republished by University of Nebraska Press. So, God is, as you know, a female middle-aged woman. Exactly. So every other chapter in this book is conquistadors lost in the tall grasses of the prairie, and he can hear Native Americans just outside of range, and things don't go well. The other chapters are contemporary young farmers who throw a bag of dope into the same field 500 years later, and the two stories come together. They were originally, of course, two different novels, and I said, we can't go on with this madness, and I managed to make them work. Okay, so I'll read you just a few pages of the opening chapter. Hi, this is God, G-O-D, God with all the big letters. I'm out here in the middle of the field. Oh yeah, I'm everywhere, duh. You can see me anytime starside, whichever star keeps the corks from going inside out. But right now I'm doing field work in the field. In particular, I'm broadcasting like the granite man on top of the Capitol building, the tallest in the state. The granite man whose hand casts out grain from a bag slung on his shoulder full of it. Broadcasting. You thought electricity, a TV special via satellite. A mile high sent it to the sky? Nope, grain. Remember, I put the Virgin Mary on the front of a box of cornstarch, no Indian maiden. The feather in her hair is a nice touch for those who recall the Virgin's exit, doves and whatnot in the jet stream. It's got to be grain for that girl. Corn, sorghum, you name it. I broadcast it. I seed it. It's all about grain. It's not all about grain. It's grass, too. Grass I care a lot about. Grass is what you have when you don't plant, but I plant that, too. You see, this field hasn't been grain from kingdom come, a season of soybeans, a rotation of rye. I'm talking pre-interstate, pre-train, pre-wagon, pre-grain, when grass grew by itself, just as grass, up to here. And wind is what broadcast it then, meaning me, of course. A wind that never stops, a wind that pets and fingers and searches the grass for whatever's lost. Grain or what? Faith? Dope. I lay the grass bit on pretty thick. I'm an imposter, of course. That's what people who live in grass that high think, and believing that keeps them looking around for a real God. Wind doesn't convince them otherwise, though goodness knows I blow plenty of that here. No light-handed broadcaster am I. But these people don't even sniff at wind. They have to have the incarnate, the usual meat, to make them mellow out and believe. Not that they don't already have it in one tall pigeon eye, but they don't give him the credit. He has a hard time of it. It's all about timing. Except for me, I'm out of time, broadcasting whenever, a pretend imposter with no megaphones or ziggurats, though never subtle. I say, you're going to end up dirt, then grass. What do you think? Timing is everything, is what I think. This is God, G-O-D, added W. Moore, and I'm broadcasting on the radio. So that's the beginning. Just teasing you. It's a little irreligious. This is a memoir. I'm reading to you mostly from books that were about Nebraska. It won the Gray Wolf Nonfiction Prize, and it was Best of Japan in 2008. And I guess I made the most money on it than any other book. Very proud of that. And it's a story about my uncle, who was an MP in post-war Japan, in the largest what are they called, stockade in Asia, where they collected all of the American GIs who had been convicted of a crime from all over the Pacific to await the boat for Fort Leavenworth. One doesn't think about that at the end of the war. It's something they had to do. Oddly enough, 8% of our armed forces were people of color, and 80% of the crimes were committed by them. So when I begin to understand the military and its prejudices and so forth, then the fact that my uncle, toward the, I don't know, I guess the end of the time he was there, his captain brought all the MPs together and said that the stockade was getting crowded and they were going to have to start executing. You begin to understand that I had to go and look at the history of military and segregation and Abu Ghraib, actually. Anyway, I'll read the opening. I started as a pacifist, and at the end I understand what a soldier does. My uncle is Superman. Oh, he was from Grant. With black Clark Kent glasses, grapefruit-sized biceps, lots of brilliantine, thick, dark hair, and a solid jaw, 6'4" and as handsome as all get out, he's the perfect match for kryptonite. He even keeps a photo of himself as a high school Adonis, Lincoln High, veins bulging. Now, at 2004, after making millions in farming, restaurants, and real estate, instead of swooping down and rescuing people from burning buildings, he volunteers for Meals on Wheels, just what Superman would have taken on in his advanced years. I suspect this Superman shtick also has something to do with Nietzsche's will to power. After all, Grandma had more than a whiff of German in her Czech fierceness. Make the best better, reads the ornately written note I found in her purse after her funeral. My uncle was her baby. He bore a golden sheen that lit his life, made him special, a man with muscle. A few years ago, he tried to convince me that his 18 months in the Army would make a terrific movie, or at least a great book. I was there during the occupation of Japan, right after World War II, he said. They found out we were less barbaric than they were taught. It's quite a story. I rolled my eyes. Superman had gone too far. I put his confidence, you know how it is, you're the writer of the family, right? I put his confidence down to the vanity of old age, the vanity of somebody who still, at nearly 80, held himself and his washboard stomach as proudly as any of the Supermen, screen or comic book. But he was adamant, so sure of his story, and of my taking it on as the writer in the family. War stories, I laughed. Let me tell you how hard it is to get a book published. If you're a real Svoboda, he says, you'll figure out a way. It'll be worth it to you. And the next bit is a quote from the tapes that he made for me. It was a beautiful day, so I decided to walk several more miles out into the country. I came across a large orchard, perhaps an apple orchard. About 100 airplanes were hidden underneath the leaf canopy. Most of them looked like they were general aviation planes and some old military planes. They were parked in nice, neat rows. I wandered over to several of them. I've always been interested in old planes. They were poorly equipped with what I'd call makeshift armament, kind of old, with little bomb bays crudely cut into them. I never found out if these were general aircraft that people were trying to hide from our bombing, or if they were the kamikaze, kind of a last straw type of thing. The sun was filtering through the leaf canopy, and I was the only person there, going from aircraft to aircraft. It felt like the dying of a country or a giving up. In spring 2004, reports about Abu Ghraib filled the newspapers. By April, the radio talks of nothing else, especially the kind of radio that everyone in small-town Nebraska listens to, the Rush Limbaugh who rationalizes it all away. We're going to ruin people's lives over it, and we're going to hamper our military effort, and then we're really going to hammer them because they had a good time. I'm talking about people having a good time. These people, you ever heard of emotional release? You ever heard of needing to blow some steam off? My dad calls me around then and mentions that his brother has fallen into a deep depression. I think it has to do with what's going on, he says. He's got plenty of money, his kids are okay, his wife just bought a new Cadillac. He's never been depressed before. The psychiatric ward my uncle checks himself into is dead in the center of the country. Grand Island, I think. Only one shrink runs the operation. There are no more psychiatrists for another 150 miles. The facility got its start by taking in the settlers, who were driven crazy by the solitude that the Homestead Act had forced them into, pioneering one farm every 160 acres. On the 5th of July, he calls his daughter Chris and demands to be let out. Maybe he watched all the 4th of July TV. Maybe the military played their pageant music nonstop. Surely there were World War II reruns up the kazoo on cable. He tells her he has to get out that very night or else. Chris hears that or else better than most. She's a psychologist with her own practice and suggests he hire a private plane and fly down to Texas where she lives. He was too close to suicide for antidepressants alone, Chris writes me later. I imagine that professionally speaking, she hesitates. Perhaps she mentions how slowly antidepressants kick in. Sometimes it takes as long as 6 weeks. But he is her father, and nobody else close to him, or anyone else within those 150 miles, will take the professional interest she does. At 3 a.m., July 6, he and his wife hire a plane to fly to Texas. He can't wait for morning. It doesn't end well. Okay. I hope you don't mind me going around like this. It's just kind of fun for me. This is Bohemian Girl, which of course is me in the 19th century, trying to face up to Willa Cather, who's like, to me, this huge blackbird over in Nebraska, trying to attack any writers in her area. Maybe that's the New York perspective, but anyway. The actual plot for this book is that it's a girl about 10 who she was lost in a bet that her father made with a Native American, and so she has to go be sort of indentured to him for a certain amount of time. Chapter 3, and this is from the Native American point of view, and I call it them Indians in this one because back then you called them Indians. Okay, and so what she's doing actually is she's helping to make one of those mounds. They're so famous in Ohio, but I put one here. What can I say? The mound needs strength. The Indian taps his pipe bowl. Its long, straight stem is new, its length wrapped in telegraph wire some other Indians found beside a pole, or so they said. What was it doing beside the pole and not strung on it, is what he asked. He collected the pipe bowl by riding 8 days to the quarry where he met his 5th brother, William the Hat, who listens now even while he sleeps, which is what he likes doing best. A nice soft deerskin, a smoky shelter, who could not? William the Hat sighs in the happiness of his half-dream and says out loud, "The bones of the slave are what strengthens the mound, leg, bone, arm, skull. In the 2 years she's laid there, the mound has not washed away." "Slaves do their best work alive," says the Indian. William the Hat takes his turn at the pipe. "They do not think that in London," he says. "The bridge there is said to have many bones in it, the workmen's, even the children of the workmen. It's very strong. They wall them in alive." True. "They must have a lot of workmen. I still wonder why she died from that mushroom," said the Indian, shrugging. "A mushroom that's not even bad. It can give you stomach trouble, yes, but the worse are unripe beans." "Oh, you can't keep them from Indian food." "True," says the Indian. "I trade for the whitest flowers and even once a nice strawberry and sugar, jam. Jam, they think we're stronger with our food." "We're just stronger. But you should see the mound that whites make in their cities. Eagle nest high. Monument," William the Hat says in 3 parts. "I would go to see these cities, their mints," says the Indian, "but their women tempt me. Horsefat knows this. She caught me wearing a blanket over one arm like a bachelor." William snores. He is not wearing the derby he prizes, the only souvenir for his time of captivity he did not give away. It lies beside him, a small dark animal curled up at the edges. The Indian stirs the coals red and relights his pipe. Umbrella, giving the God-forgotten wire bird trees to everyone, so everyone would think they were crazy, and not you. Oh, so clever, William. Umbrella. No one stoned you like they did the Indian who traveled there and came back with just one clock. Stoning, always the stoning, says William, turning on his side. I say, let's show off the slaves the way they do us when they catch us. That's my new idea since you have come. Let's put them in our clothes and take them around. Others will feed us for a chance to see slaves dressed like this. Servants, says William. They like to be called servants. Oh, they could eat their own food, and we could make them wear paint and feathers the way we dressed for last year's sex dances. No one will believe they're white. Look at their skin now, as brown as yours. The two men watch the smallest as she enters with a haul of buffalo chips. She's unripe, says the Indian, and ugly, such small feet. Bonnet shreds lie limp around her neck. She squats and lets the buffalo chips fall out of her doubled shirt front. That's chapter 3. But now what else am I going to say? Just got a couple more. This is a book called Treason, a play on my name. Well, the author just gets to do things like that. Anyway, it's about betrayal. And it was published by Zoo Press, which was short-lived press that was from Lincoln, Nebraska. Alas, it collapsed, and then I had to take care of the distribution myself, but they did a nice job. And this is a poem, so you have to readjust your ears again. It's called Destiny Manifest. It's about my dad, who died January. Your fence meets your fence. The sawtooth borders contiguous. You can't even see it all. Shade moves its bars like latitudes across the no tree, no cow plain. Land is plain, unwrit and lasting. You long to envelop the map with circumference. I have seen you look down and look up like that in such lust. Your binoculars pick out antelope that move no closer than X power, that canter back as if there's a line. Like the concentrics of the eagle, a thermal over, like water after a stone. No, wait a minute, here it is. And last but not least, good old Great American Desert. Well, it's been published since March, so I'm feeling like it's been around a while. The Great American Desert, as you perhaps know, was named by crabby Major Long when he was tired of not finding any rivers or anything interesting for him. My second story, Major Long Talks to His Horse, kind of covers that. And it starts in the prehistoric era with the Clovis people, and it ends in the far future. And I did that because that way you can kind of, environmental change is not contiguous with human life, so you kind of have to stretch it out so you can see the sorts of things that happen. And this one, I guess because we were talking about dust storms earlier, it's called Dirty 30s. It's about sex. Sort of. Of course. Peel these couple of potatoes and make the pig happy, her sister says. It's been eating dirt. Molly gets taken by the arm into the kitchen. Molly looking right past her. She is the shorter sister. Right past her ear. You see another duster, says her sister. That spread of cloud isn't a thing to worry over. She gives Molly the peeler to grip. Molly takes up a potato in such a way as to break your heart, like it was left alone in the bin, which it almost is. Her sister goes about her business, ripping feed sacks into strips. She has been up to this since early morning, since she saw her head shape in dust around her pillow. She has seen that before, when she was sure no weather like this could go on and on. She didn't fuss with caulking the windows with feed sack. She's going to fuss now. She was never so careful a cleaner as Molly. Molly used to sweep at the dust in the middle of the night. She steps out of the barn to get another sack to rip and returns quick. The kitchen's empty. She throws down her burden. She wipes her hands on her bum. Molly, where she finds her, this time in the bedroom, Molly's face is wet, teared up. The pump's about dry out there, and you've got it spurting, says her sister. She drags her back into the kitchen. She finishes the potatoes herself with Molly looking on and on. You've got to keep busy, she says. She gives her the scrub brush. Molly sinks to her knees. There is hardly room for both women in the kitchen, and Molly works wide. We'll scrub out a whole corner in a single swath. Her sister splashes down some dishwater, and Molly scrubs and scrubs, then sits back on her haunches and looks toward the bedroom and coughs. You catch that dust cough now? Her sister pours milk into a cup and gives it to her. Tastes like tumbleweed, she says. Cows don't eat anything else. Molly stares into the cup. Slowly, she drinks it. You're beginning to wonder when the sex comes up, aren't you? Her sister starts ripping the strips of feed sack again, humming what song she heard on the neighbor's radio. Car coming, she says after a bit. Molly's already half-legged it back to the bedroom. Her sister doesn't aim to stop her. She hasn't the heart for it. She knows who's coming, too. The old young man drags in, his breeches gone to thread and his head low. Molly any better? She's in the room, she says. He takes a seat on a turned-around spindle-back chair. Well, get her out. You do it. He does not so much as move a muscle. Molly, come on, she says. He's here. He's tired of coming. She has to pull her out this time, pry her fingers free of the door frame. Then she forces her to sit beside him at the table that he's pulled the chair to. Molly coughs. Honey, he takes her hand. I kept her in the house all day today, her sister says. It's not so far to the road that if she'd run, with her luck, there'd be a car coming. There are more cars today going away. Molly turns his hand over and touches where it is lined with dirt. The baby, she says, quiet, as if it will wake. He flips his hand and holds hers down so she can't get away. He heaves a sad sigh and sticks his head even with Molly's so as to look her in the eye. Molly breathes heavy as if her stomach's about to turn. After a while of watching the two of them, her sister says, You got to try to work the plow again. We can't eat a plow. He drops Molly's hand, runs his own through his hair, says, Another duster's coming. Oh, you're as bad as her. She takes things out of the cupboard they're kept in. Flour goes in a cup. She ladles water into it. He watches her as if he's out of practice looking. Then he looks into Molly's face again, where it is crossed with dirty tears. Then he stops. Sawyer said he found his way back to his house today only because his fence was glowing like a light bulb. You don't say, her sister says. She has a paste of flour and water going. Some kind of electricity that comes with the dust lit it right up, made the fence come alive. Molly starts. What does she hear? Alive? She wrenches free and gets up out of her chair and takes a step for the door of the bedroom. Dead is dead, she knows it, says the man. Molly has her back to them. She's dragging herself almost to the threshold. Her sister says, Cold for July, and shifts the cup toward the window where a single cloud sits over by where they once wanted to put in a big new street, or so she says, and then goes on, Old man Dickens walked all the way over here to give me these feed sacks. Nice of him, he says. Molly has slipped out of the room. Her sister slathers a strip of sack with flour paste, her hand running it the whole length. He watches her. I tore up the cover, he said yesterday, before the storm, just before. The cover? The bed cover? I mean, he puts his hands to his eyes and rubs. I mean land cover. I did plow, and the land pulled back as nice as a piece of cake. It would have grown corn. It was that kind of dirt. I plowed it, and it come up, and when the wind blew it away like it was waiting for me to get a mouthful of it. He scratches at his stiff hair. I want the flour sifter if you can spare it. No, she says. After Sawyer told me about the electrified fence, he showed me an arrowhead the size of a knife blade. Yay size, he says, his hands wide. He said it took a flour sifter down to his blowout and found it. It's worth money. Not with a sifter did he find something as big as that. You find it yourself with your eyes. I ain't got the knack, he says, looking hard at her. She wipes the paste off her finger and goes in and brings Molly back into the kitchen, gets her set up with the scrub brush again. Molly scrubs out a new corner, moving the dust and water in dark swirls. Maybe if she were expecting again, her sister says, maybe that would perk her up. The man slaps his thigh, and dust from his pants rises into the air. I don't know how that will happen. You know, she won't set foot in my car, and she sure won't let me into the bedroom. Molly scrubs. Her sister applies the wet feed sack strip to the window crack, the one side where the dust blows in worst. A corner of the land blown right off, he says. I just wanted to stomp the land back down. Weeds grow anyway. Why not what I try to plant? Molly starts sobbing. He looks at her sister. They both step away from Molly's shaking shoulders. As if the kitchen were huge, they step back. 4 months almost to the day, he says, and shivers. She was watching him fine, just fine in that room. I don't see why she thinks she wasn't. Stray dust smacks the window. Even wrapped him in rags of turpentine, says her sister. He hardly even coughed. Molly coughs, gets up off her knees, and stumbling runs back into the bedroom again. Her sister starts pressing the strip into the window wood, but the top of the strip is so heavy with paste it bows and peels down. You could help, she says. He stands at the threshold of the bedroom, then he doesn't. He is over by the stove. He is beside her. He holds the strip into place while she rubs more paste into another, more flour than they don't have much of, less water. His arm sweats not so far from hers. His filthy hand is right next to her face. The sister bites his thumb. He doesn't pull away. She bites him again, holding the new strip against the dust that is coming no matter what she does. So that was the sex. Thank you very much. That's it, Ski. I'll tell you what I'm working on now. How's that for a warm-up? I just like the title. Maybe I'll never write the book because I like the title so much. Hitler and My Mother-in-Law. It's a joke already, right? So my mother-in-law was a war correspondent in World War II. And there's a photograph of her standing next to a pile of ashes. And she was, because she was a civilian, she was called in to identify Hitler. Of course, everybody knew that it wasn't Hitler. So the book is about propaganda. I mean, theoretically, the theoretical book, I've only got like 10 pages, is about propaganda. All right, so there I answered your question.
How long does it take you to usually write a book?
About 10 years.
Oh.
So, as I explained before, I write a lot of different ones at the same time, and when I get frustrated with one, I turn to the other. So it's kind of out of failure I've written so many books, because I would go to another project and then learn something that I could then, fool around the other one and make it finally work. That's sort of how I did Tin God. I did a bunch of short stories, and finally I saw how I could get the two narratives to coax them together to turn into one grand ending. Yes?
The book about occupied Japan, did you find any primary sources in your research about men who were in prison there? And what they were thinking as they were being brought back to Lebanon?
So I did a lot of research for that, and I spent a lot of time at the National Archives in Maryland. And I interviewed among my uncle's fellow MPs. There were 5 of them that I managed to reach, or 5 that would talk to me about this subject. There were a number of people who would say, oh, and then hang up. So, but 5 people remember seeing someone actually executed. And, but apparently eyewitnesses are not counted as evidence. So when I went to the National Archives and I pursued this line of, comparing the number of people executed for crimes in the Army, of which there are 6 different tallies. They've never figured out how many they've executed. And looking at these giant books that tell you what happened to anybody who died in the service, whenever I get close to an answer, the footnote would be ripped out. I am not innocent of my conspiracy theory possibilities, but it just seemed to be like a lot of coincidence that would be so difficult to find out. And so the book itself is like a mystery story, and you get to see all my frustrations and all the various ways that I tried to find out beyond the testimony of the people that I interviewed what really went on. Yeah, it was fun. Yeah. Okay, well, you're just going to have to be interested. Yes.
You're from Ogallala
I am.
and graduated from there?
Ogallala High School, yes.
Yeah, and then did what?
I went to 8 colleges after that. Well, it was the late 60s, early 70s, and it was fun. I was good at registering. I loved libraries. I got to look at a lot of good libraries. And then when my professional life, I've taught at 15 universities. Obviously, I must like them. I ended up teaching at Columbia after I graduated with an MFA there. 35 years later, I taught there, so it seemed reasonable to quit at that point. Yes?
You've written so many different types of
Yes.
books. Do you have a favorite?
Well, I have about 3 novels that I'm trying to unload, so maybe novels at this point. But I am facing this memoir idea. Actually, I found it very painful to write a memoir, at least one about my uncle, because I had to write about myself, and you have to be actually truthful. And so I don't know. And of course, this is going to involve my husband and his family. And as far as I can tell, there is no way you can please anyone when you write about them. I know this first book of mine, the first book of poems, it is not a particularly flattering portrait of my mother. And all she said was, "Why did you have me wear a sweater that was obviously too big for me in that poem?" So, you just can't win. Yes.
So when you did your book of translation
Yes.
of the newer
Yes.
people, do you speak their language then?
So she is referring to a turning point in my life. In the middle of getting a master's degree at Columbia, I went off to assist in an ethnographic film called The New Era because my boyfriend had made the be-all and end-all ethnographic film in 1968, and it was discovered in the early 70s that it didn't include any women. And that was sort of the thing that people were interested in the 70s. So we went back to make that film. And en route, I spent 6 months working with the Smithsonian in the South Pacific. So I have another book kind of about that experience. But so I became very attached. I spent a year in the South Sudan with a people called the New Era, of which you have many here. I have had a program at UNL about the congruencies between life in New Era land and Nebraska, of which there are many, oddly enough. It is a cattle-based society. And I finished this book of translations called Clean the Crocodile's Teeth, which is the only book that has been written, in translation of their literature, which is vast. I was, of course, in my 20s, and I thought, well, of course, I can just go to this place with a couple million people and write down their songs. And not only that, it was an oral tradition, so that everything was sung. They'd have a wedding and everything would be sung. So, well, at least I was young and didn't know any better. And I made, the film was never finished, but then I began a parallel career in video art, and I co-produced a TV series and did a lot of media also. It was, I was busy. I had a couple of kids, too. Whenever I talk to groups from kids from Nebraska, I always encourage them to think of the wider world because it gives them more perspective. When you come back to Nebraska, you know what you really love about it. And I remember I had a talk at the Ogallala High School, and the headline was, "Writer says it's not worth staying here," or something like that. Not what I had meant to be remembered by. Yeah. Yes.
So who are the authors, or what are the books that you look to, either for inspiration or the ones that you regard the highest?
That is an impossible question. However, right now, Karen Russell has been hustling my book for me. So I'm very fond of Karen at the moment. I studied under Gordon Lish, who writes really crazy books. He was known as the kind of the king of fiction in the 90s. He was the editor of Esquire, and he promulgated, well, first of all, he had these classes that started at 6 o'clock at night and ended at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, and you weren't allowed to speak. He only spoke. And it was like est for writing, very persuasive, and he was so passionate about, about the act of writing. There were people there on respirators because he convinced people that that was the only thing worth living doing, only thing worth doing while you were alive. And so the other thing he believed was the primacy of the word and the sentence. As I was explaining earlier, that people generally think about the 19th century novel where character and plot is most important, and that the aim is to have the reader disappear into the narrative and experience it as kind of a movie in the head. But he wanted to move beyond that model into the 21st century, in which each word would be its own little dynamic plot. And so it's obvious when you really look at literature that it's not always character and plot. There are many other things that propel you into the next sentence. But when you look at it on such a granular level, it was particularly appealing to me, who had started off as a poet. There is a whole dynamic, muscly experience that goes on from sentence to sentence and between sentences that can be manipulated. So that was very important to me to think about and verify that I was on the right track there. I just couldn't do that 19th century stuff where you open the door and then you have to remember to close the door at the end of the chapter, or I was going to wonder what happened. And my first novel reflects that the best because the first novel, called Cannibal, was written about the guy I was with, about being in the South Sudan. I understood that I couldn't do interior dialogue because I didn't know what the Africans were thinking. I had really absolutely no idea. And when I finally got to that point, I had been attempting to write this book for about 10 years, and the man I was with happened to mention casually that he was with the CIA while we were doing that, and I said, I don't know whether he was telling the truth or not, but then you begin to think that you didn't know what he was thinking either. So I wrote it in a very focused, very tight first person so that you really don't know anything other than what she sees. And that isn't the answer to your question, but that was my way of getting through it. Thank you. At this age, proper nouns are less facile. They're harder to conjure up.
So thank you so much, Grace.
Thanks.
And here's the love gift.
Yeah.
A little gift from the Heritage
thank you.
Room,
So
something
sweet
to
of you.
remember us by.
Yes.
Thanks.